Okay, so we're gonna actually, that's interesting. That is, I am missing a page from my notes. Huh. Oh well, fortunately I remember what the original stuff is. I'm just concerned because that probably means that somewhere in my sermon there's a random page that isn't gonna make any sense to me, so I gotta go looking for that in a minute here. So, we talked 2 weeks ago, at the end of the lesson, I talked a little bit about Daniel's prophecies. Daniel is the one guy who specifically talks about the things that are going to go on in the time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And so his prophecies begin with what's already going on with him, which is the Babylonian and Persian empires, and they go all the way through Rome. And in particular, the second chapter of Daniel details a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has of a statue. We looked at this last week. I want to look at it again briefly here. Daniel interprets the dream. Well, first he tells Darius what the dream was, and then he interprets it for him. He says, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory, and wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. After you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you." That one would be the silver part. "Then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron. As iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces," and he doesn't mean iron that breaks in pieces, he means iron that breaks things into pieces, "it will crush and break all these previous empires into pieces." Now, as we go through the book of Daniel, the interpretation of what each of these kingdoms are becomes increasingly apparent. Daniel helps us out with the first one because he says, you're the head of gold. So he tells Nebuchadnezzar that he is the head of gold. And we know by looking at some of the later prophecies, and we will look at some of those as we go through this study, as we look at some of the later prophecies, it's clear that the shoulders and arms of silver are referring to Medo-Persia, that is going to conquer Babylon very soon after this. The belly and thighs of bronze are Greece, and then the iron and the iron and clay are Rome. And so those four kingdoms are the ones that Daniel has, or that Daniel interprets this vision of. And throughout the book of Daniel, he continues to have visions about those four kingdoms. Not all of them in every vision, but about various ones. And some of his visions get very detailed. If you look over in Daniel chapter 11, you'll see he goes through and gives some very detailed information about actually what we're going to be, well, not what we're going to be talking about today, but what we're going to be looking at in a little while, which is some of the kingdoms of Greece. So Daniel's, his visions and the visions that he interprets speak to us about this time between the Testaments. And so we've already taken a look in the last couple of weeks at the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire. And so we're getting ready to look at Greece. Sorry, I forgot there's an additional part of this. He says, "In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. But it will have in it the toughness of iron, and as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong, and part of it will be brittle." So he gets kind of specific about Rome in this place, but he's going to get a lot more specific later on. So today we're going to be looking at the time between the Testaments, and we're going to take a look at classical Greece right now. Greece is divided into a number of different time periods, but ancient Greece in general is divided into several different significant time periods. Archaic Greece, which is the olden days, back in the Trojan War kind of days, although that's a myth, but nevertheless, the Trojan War days. Classical Greece is the second major era of the, sorry, I said classical Greece. It's Archaic Greece, classical Greece, and then, forgetting the third one, Hellenic or Hellenistic Greece. This is ancient Greece, I should say. I think I said classical Greece. Ancient Greece is divided into several different sections. Classical Greece is one of the major ones. Now, to understand Greece, we actually have to go back and look at Persia for just a second here. We talked about the kings of Medo-Persia several weeks in a row. Cyrus II, who allowed the exiles from Israel to return, he was one of the ones that conquered a great deal of what would become the Persian Empire, the Median and Persian Empire. Darius I, who was not his son, was actually a usurper to the throne, but continued most of his policies, and actually was very successful in following him along. Under him, the Second Temple was completed. Then we have Xerxes I, who is Darius' son. He is the king that marries Esther, and ultimately the Babylonian Empire will reach its greatest extent under Xerxes. And then his, I believe, grandson or great-grandson, Artaxerxes I, he was the one who authorized Ezra and Nehemiah to oversee the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Those are the major kings of Medo-Persia. There are a number of them that come in between Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and there are several that come after Artaxerxes as well. But ultimately, like I said, the Persian Empire at its greatest encompasses all of this area. This is the Mediterranean Sea, so it encompasses most of Egypt. It encompasses all of Asia Minor, all of Syria, and Palestine, the Levant, all of what used to be Babylonia and Assyria, and all the way over here into what's considered the origin of the Medo-Persian Empire. It also comes up here and gets the edge of Greece. Greece has got, basically there are three parts to Greece. There is don't do that. There is the continental section of Greece that's up in here. There is Greece, the islands, the city-states of Greece, like Athens and Sparta, that are kind of the classical idea of Greece. And then there's kind of this peninsular Greece that kind of goes across in this area here. And ultimately, Persia was able to conquer all of this area of continental Greece. They were not ultimately successful in conquering the island city-states of Greece. And what happened in that situation was this area up in here is referred to, there's two of them. This is Thrace, and what is this one called? I can't remember what this one is called. Well, Thrace and Macedon, but a lot of this area is referred to as Ionia. And what happens is that in 499, the Ionian Greeks rebel against the reign of the Persians, and they start a war with them, and they're funded by some of the Greek city-states down here, particularly Athens helps to fund the war. And ultimately then what happens between 499 and 494 is that Persia has to send a bunch of armies over here to basically pacify and put an end to the revolt that's going on. And they were able to figure out pretty quickly, once the revolt was over, that Athens and the rest of Greece were kind of helping to fund this rebellion, and they didn't take to it very well. So in 490 BC, Persia invaded with the intention of actually invading all of Greece and conquering all of Greece. They sent an army across the land area here. They sent ships this way. But ultimately at a battle called Marathon, which you may have heard of, although perhaps not in the context of it being the Battle of Marathon. But in 490 BC, Athens wins a victory at the Battle of Marathon that is ultimately pretty decisive, and the Persians decide that it's not worth it and they go home. And so they were able to keep the Persians out of the Greek islands and city-states in the south there. So that lasted for about 10 years. And then after about 10 years, in 480 BC, Persia decided to invade again. The first group, the first army that was sent in was under Darius I. The second group that was sent in was under Xerxes, the one who had married Esther. Xerxes sent in a massive army, both by land heading up this way and also by sea, trying to get in. Ultimately, the idea was basically, you come up around here, you circle around there, and you get into the land area of southern Greece. You send your ships up and you come from the other direction and you conquer them. So he sends this massive army headed towards Athens, or headed towards Greece in order to conquer southern Greece and be done with them once and for all, basically. And that's where we get to Thermopylae, one of the most famous battles in ancient history because of the odds and because of the things that are going on around there. And the Battle of Thermopylae took place, let me see if I can find a, yeah, here we go. So the Battle of Thermopylae, this is that, remember when I said that Greece is the Greece proper is kind of this island and this peninsular area. This is actually, where is it? Come on, there we go. This is that area blown up. And so what we actually can see here is Thermopylae is right here. Actually, that's not right. Thermopylae is, sorry, Thermopylae is actually up here. You can't, it's not marked on this map. It's right in here. And basically what happened is the Persians came up and around like this and came down through here. And there's a lot of terrain in here that's functionally impassable for an entire army. So in essence, what they had to do was to come out here onto the edge of the area and bring their army around this way. And to get through here, they had to go past a place called Thermopylae, which is translated into English as the hot gates. And it's because there's sulfur springs around there that actually make steam and stuff come off of there. But they're referred to as the hot gates because it's a narrow pass, wide enough for maybe 6 or 8 men to walk side by side. And so in this narrow pass, the Greeks decided to send an army there to try to stop the Persians from going through. At the same time, Persia also sent a fleet, a naval fleet over this way that ultimately engaged in a battle. I believe it's up in here, and the battle was called the Battle of Artemisium. And the Battle of Artemisium was a naval battle. Ultimately, in that naval battle, the Persians were victorious. It was kind of a draw, but ultimately the Greeks had to retreat, and they retreated basically back down to a place called Salamis. I don't know exactly where it is in the map because it's not really important to us. But they were retreated away, and that allowed the Persians to move on forward, which made what was going on at Thermopylae even more important. So at Thermopylae, a force of about 7,000 Greeks altogether got into that pass to guard the pass, and they were led by 300 Spartans who themselves were commanded by King Leonidas of the Spartans. This narrow pass, the idea was that a small army ought to be able to hold against a major force, which was kind of helpful because modern day estimates say that the army the Persians were fielding was 100 to 150,000 men against 7,000. At the time, classical estimates were that there were 1 million of them, but that seems very unlikely in modern times. But nevertheless, 7,000 against 150,000 is a pretty bad set of odds there. And so the Greeks the idea was you get in that narrow pass and it will prevent them from using their numbers. They'll have to come at you in a limited group of numbers, and that will allow you to hold the pass for a very long time and maybe not win the battle, but at least cause it a massive delaying action there. And so it's important to understand your people. And the reality was that just in general, the Greeks were better armed and better trained than the Persians were. The Persians had a lot of conscripts. They had a lot of people who were minimally trained and minimally well armed, whereas the Greeks were all trained and armed. And foremost among those were, of course, the Spartans. The Spartans were the Greek equivalent of the modern day, like, force recon Marines. They weren't just the Marines, they were like the best of the Marines. The Spartans, they came from a place called Laconia, which is a section of Greece there, and it's where we get the phrase laconic. And laconic is usually used to describe somebody whose answers are short and who tend to have a dry sense of humor. And indeed, when the Spartans were approached by an emissary of Xerxes telling them to surrender, and they made various threats, and one of the threats was, the arrows of our archers will blot out the sun. And the reply of one of the Spartan soldiers was, well, then at least we will be fighting in the shade. So these guys are kind of, they are what they are. Anyway, so basically the Spartans and the rest of the Greeks are able to hold that pass for 7 days. Some of that 7 days is negotiating back and forth and just basically wasting time to see how long they can get the Persians to wait before they attack. But finally, on the 5th day, the Persians did attack, and so for 3 days of battle, the Spartans and the rest of the Greeks were able to hold off the Persians. Unfortunately, a guy named Ephialtes, who was a local shepherd who knew the area around there, betrayed the Athenians, the Spartans, all of the Greeks, betrayed them to the Persians and told them about a shepherd's path that basically went up, and so you have this narrow area through here, but then there's this shepherd's path that kind of goes up and around behind to where the area opens back up again. And that enabled the Persians to bring their forces slowly, but nevertheless over the course of that 3rd day, to where they basically were able to come around behind and this come at the back of the Spartans and the rest of the Greeks. Leonidas became aware of the fact that they were being encircled, and he basically ordered the rest of the Greeks to go home and stayed behind with the 300 Spartans and 700 men from Thessalonica, and they fought that holding action that third day. They were all killed, but ultimately, in the process of delaying them for that long, it gave the Athenians and some of the other Greek states time to start mustering their defenses in order to actually deal with the invasion that was coming. And so what else ends up happening, and I know you can't see all of this on here, I've got the markers are on here more to help me remember than anybody else. You have this whole series of land and naval battles that take place, with the Persians coming around this sort of narrow area, and then by sea coming in this way. And there's a whole series of different battles that take place, but ultimately in 480 there is a second naval battle. So later that same year there's a second naval battle, the Battle of Salamis, and there the Athenians and the other Greek states are successful in basically destroying or largely destroying Xerxes' navy. That was aided by the one of the things about modern day ship combat that we don't really think about this anymore is that our ships are designed to deal with some very, very severe weather. Or if there's severe weather coming, they kind of tend to know about it and they have ways to avoid it. Back then, none of those things were true, and so like a half of Xerxes' fleet sunk in a storm over here before they ever got around to Salamis to actually fight the second battle, which gave the Greeks a pretty big advantage in that particular battle. So they were successful there, and then in 479 there was a second battle called the Battle of Plataea that took place where, in this case, all of the Greek city-states unified together and fielded an army. Well, it wasn't, I don't think, quite as large as the Persians because they were all better equipped and better trained. They wiped them out. And so Persia left. And Persia never really attempted to invade Greece again after that because they were just, they realized they couldn't project power that far away from the center of their empire and have any real chance of doing it. So what ends up happening is there's kind of this stalemate for a long time. Persia controls, this is the continent kind of goes back that way. But Persia controls all the way out to here. They also control up in here through Thrace and through Macedonia. So what happens is there's a series of wars that they're called the Greco-Roman Wars that basically take place as Greece tries to drive Persia completely out of their territory. And so between 480 and 346, there's a whole series of these different things that go on. First of all, in 478, the Greek city-states, they formed something called the Delian League, which was basically all of those southern Greek capitals and city-states that got together and banded together to fight against Persia. You remember what I said last week that one of the great problems with, or 2 weeks ago, one of the great problems with empires is that they contain the seeds of defeat, of their own defeat kind of built into them. And in many ways, this is what happens to Persia, because Persia, by invading Greece and becoming this much of a threat, causes them to ally together, and they start to realize just what they can do when they're working together. So they begin to fight back against Persia. By 466, they've completely expelled the Persians from Greece, from all the parts of Greece, including the continent. By 449, the Greco-Persian Wars end, and by that time, Athens is now fully in control of the Delian League. So the Delian League is all of these Greek city-states, except that Sparta doesn't want anything to do with it. As soon as they're done, Sparta says, we're going back to our own business, leave us alone, and they go back to doing their own thing. So then in between 431 and 404, we have the Peloponnesian War, which is actually a war between Athens and Sparta. So Athens is leading the Delian League. Sparta has formed an allegiance with some of the other city-states called the Peloponnesian League. And so ultimately, Sparta ends up winning that thing. So this war goes on for quite a while. Sparta wins. And so between 405 and 371, we have the Spartan Empire. And the Spartans control pretty much all of Greece, both the islands, the city-states, the continental part of Greece. They are in control of all of it. But it doesn't last that long because the Spartans are good at fighting battles and wars, but their philosophical approach to governing is basically, I don't want to do anything that I don't have to do. And that's not really a very effective way to govern it. So basically they just kind of, they're so hands-off that it very quickly got away from it. And so by 378, Thebes, which is one of the Greek city-states, rebelled against Sparta. Between 375 and 346, Thebes and Athens begin to compete for Greek hegemony. Hegemony is the control of the area. So what happens is Sparta basically backs away, and Thebes and Athens start fighting to see who can be on top. And ultimately, Thebes begins a battle with a company with an area called Phocis, which is one of the areas of another one of the areas of Greece, and they aren't doing very well in this battle. The Athenians are kind of hesitant to join in because they don't want to get caught up in all this. And so in 346, the Thebans appeal to Philip II of Macedon to aid in the war with Phocis, which turns out to be hugely successful in the sense of ending the war and hugely disastrous in the sense of what happens next. So, just in real simple terms on the map here, because I know this is all just a lot of words, but basically, this is Phocis right here. This is this area down in here, right next to them, basically, is Sparta. Athens is, where is Athens? I believe Athens is up in here. Actually, I'm going to have to come over here and see this better. Let me see. Okay, so Thebes is right here. Athens, where are you? It shouldn't be that hard. All right, well, I'm thinking Athens is right up in here. For some reason, I can't see it on the map, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So basically what happens is that these two areas get into this fight with Phocis, and they are having a hard time winning it. They get up here, and they come to Macedonia, and they call for Philip, who is the king of Macedonia, to come down and help them out. And what they end up doing is they form this alliance. So they end up forming this, the Greeks end up forming this alliance that's called the League of Corinth at this period of time to fight against Phocis. In the meantime, so this is what's going on down here in southern Greece. All this stuff down here is all in southern Greece. In the meantime, up here, as these guys are getting all involved with what's going on down here, Macedonia, which is now free from Persian rule, is starting to conquer the areas around it. And so Macedonia is a guy named Philip II of Macedon in 359 BC, so that we're jumping back a little bit in time. But in 359 BC, Philip II consolidated rule over Macedonia. So he got control of this area, basically this area here. He would go on then from there to, let's see, I've lost my, there it is. He would then go on to conquer basically in 3 years, he would conquer all of continental Greece, all of the northern part of Greece. And then between 356 and 346, the Phocian War went on. The League of Corinth was formed by the people, the Greeks. And then in 346, he was asked to come down and help out. Well, he did, and immediately tried to take over. As soon as he went down, he won the war for them, and they basically said, okay, now I'm in charge. And the rest of the Greeks said, we don't think so. And Philip said, no, I insist. And so they had a series of battles that ultimately culminated in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338, at which point he beat all of them and took over. So ultimately what ends up happening is this whole thing becomes his empire. So Macedon is this central area here. This is the League of Corinth, but he now controls the League of Corinth, so it's really part of his empire. He also has all of this area up here as sort of client states. He's not like the king officially, but they all sort of work for him, and it's kind of that way down here too. They're kind of in charge of their own countries, but Philip is really in charge of everything. Persia is still over here, but Persia is now very much waning in their power and influence, certainly in Greece, but all throughout their empire. They're just gradually losing it. Now, one interesting thing I would point out here is that if you look down here, it's hard to see this because some of the colors they chose, the sea blends in really well with some of the colors, like these two areas here. But it says neutral states. What that means is that Philip wasn't able to conquer them, and you notice one of the two neutral states is Sparta. It's the one place that Philip didn't actually conquer that's actually in Greece itself. And in fact, Philip had a very rocky relationship with the Spartans. He tried to get them to join voluntarily. They didn't want anything to do with it. He sent them a message. He said, remember I said laconic speech is when you give short answers and maybe a sort of a dry sense of humor to it. He sent a message saying, if I come to you, will it be in peace or in war? And the response was neither, which is basically don't come to us. We don't want you here. A little bit later on then, the Spartans, once he conquered most of the rest of that area, he sent them a letter, he sent them a message that said, you are advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I will destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city. And the Spartans sent him back a one-word answer, if. See, if I come into your land, and their response was if. And ultimately he didn't, he just left them alone because it was just not worth it. And so So the Spartans kind of stayed out of the road. Eventually they would be conquered by with the rest of Greece, but actually not until quite a long time later. So, okay, so that gets us through Philip and the consolidation of Philip's empire. So let me jump back here for a second. So ultimately Philip, what he manages to do is to basically unify all of Greece. This is continental Greece. This is all continental Greece. This is that kind of that peninsula of Greece that goes over here. And then down here you have the classical parts of Greece. And he manages to unify all of them. Unfortunately, he also gets assassinated after he's been ruling all of this for not that long. Like I said, there's the Battle of Carona, where he ultimately conquers all of Greece. But then in 336, he is assassinated by someone in his own household. And so that's the end of it. So he only gets 2 years of having conquered the whole Grecian area before he gets killed. His son is a guy named Alexander. Alexander takes over in 336. He is only 20 years old when his father is killed. His guards are fortunately able to protect him and get him away from the scene of the assassination, or most likely he would have been killed as well. But Alexander turns out to be a particularly ruthless and very efficient kind of ruler. And between 336 and 334, he basically killed anyone who was closely enough related to him to have any chance of taking over the throne instead of him, and then consolidated control over all of Greece that his father had control of before him. So he didn't have to go back and reconquer everything, but he did have to go through and pacify a lot of places that were kind of trying to rebel and different stuff like this. Alexander, you may know him better by his longer name, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great consolidates his rule over Greece and very quickly gets bored with just ruling over Greece. So in 334, he heads off across that peninsula, and between 334 and 333, he conquers all of Asia Minor. I'll show you a map in just a second here that'll help to make some sense on this. He conquers all of Asia Minor, which is the area immediately to the east of Greece. Then between 332 and 331, he conquers the Levant. That is the area that we think of as Palestine or Judea or Israel or whatever, as well as all of Syria. So he goes across to the east, and then he drops down along the Mediterranean and conquers all of that area down in there. And then in between 331 and 330, he goes in and he conquers all of Egypt, and he founds a city called Alexandria, which of course is named after him, and which would also become one of the center capitals of the Hellenistic Greek Empire. The Greek Hellenism is interesting because it's really not based so much in classical Greece. It's based more on the continent than it is there. So he conquers Egypt. So you can understand that he's not conquering these aren't like individual nations. These are parts of Persia that he's basically just conquering one after another. So he's not having to conquer the Egyptians, he's having to conquer the Persians in order to take over Egypt. And one of the things that's happening that's kind of interesting is that compared to the Persians, Alexander was actually very respectful of local cultures, was very civilized in the way that he dealt with people, and so for the most part, most of the places that he conquered actually really liked having him there, because he was way better than the Persians were. And he instituted laws and systems that were actually much more favorable and even-handed and functional than what the Persians had. And so when he goes along and conquers these places, it's the Persians he's having to drive out. He's not having to fight against the locals for the most part. And so he's able to conquer all these areas. So in basically about 4 years, 5 years, something like that, he manages to conquer basically the entire Western Persian Empire. Okay? So if we look at the map here, this actually has the sort of the map of his progress. He starts off over here in Macedonia, crosses over, this is Asia Minor. He goes through Asia Minor and conquers all of that. Then he heads down here through Syria, down through, this is called the Levant, but it's also Palestine, whatever you want to call it. He goes down through here, goes in and conquers Egypt, and then heads back out again, and heads back up this way. So he conquers all of this area, down there, all the way up in here, in the space of about 4 or 5 years, which is insanely fast relative to everything else, because the guy is a military genius. He's commanding an army that is fanatically loyal and well-armed and well-trained, and he's fighting against an empire that, quite frankly, is on its last legs anyway. So, so he gets back up in here, and I'm just going to, whoops, I don't want to do that yet. So let me just kind of show you the route, and then we'll talk about what it means. So he comes back up through here, ultimately goes down through the south, comes across here. Let me see, I have to get over there and look at this a little better. Okay, sorry, he comes down to the south, and then he goes up north, actually, and conquers along in here, goes up into the furthest eastern edges of the empire, and then down here, and basically ultimately winds up back here again. So he works his way basically and goes through and just deliberately conquers the Persian Empire. Now while he's down here at the edge of India, he actually goes into India and does some conquering there, but it ultimately doesn't last very long. He has a really hard time holding on to that territory for a variety of reasons. So we'll continue with the conquest. So in 330 to 331, he conquered Babylonia and Assyria. So this is Babylonia and Assyria in this area here. He conquers them next. This is the northern Persian Empire. This is the southern Persian Empire through here. So he conquers Babylonia and Assyria. Then between 329 and 324, he conquers the eastern and central Persian Empire, at which point he's basically done. He's conquered all the Persian Empire, plus some additional stuff as well, and he holds Greece as well. So he's now created an empire that's bigger than the Persian Empire before him, and he's done it in the space of, 10 years. He started in 334, he's done in 324. In 10 years he conquers an area that's the size of the largest empire the world had ever seen before him. And it's pretty, it's astonishing. It's astonishing because of his military and tactical genius. It's astonishing because of what his armies were able to do. It's really kind of unheard of to conquer that much territory that quickly. So ultimately, once he's done with all of his conquests, he returns to Susa, which is the Persian capital. He stays there at Susa for about 6 months or 8 months, and then he heads down to Babylon. And in 323, he dies in Babylon. So he conquers all of the Persian Empire and some more in 10 years, and 2 years after that, he's dead. Less than 2 years after that. At the age...
Wasn't he poisoned or something?
He was, well, there's some doubts about that. There's question. It's possible he was poisoned, but he actually came down with something, and he was sick for a long time, like weeks. And there's questions about whether there was any kind of poison that was that slow acting that was available at that period of time. So the original assumption was that he was poisoned, but more recent evaluations come to suggest he may have just gotten sick with something and died.
How old was he there?
So he was, let me see, so he was 20 years old when he took the throne in 336, so he was 33 years old.
That's how I say he wasn't very old. So.
Yeah, he did not live very long, quite frankly. So it's kind of one of those, the brightest shining stars tend to go out the fastest, and that's kind of what happens to him. He's only 33 years old when he dies. And he dies without an heir. Now it turns out that his wife was pregnant at the time that he died. He just didn't know it. They weren't aware of it, and she ended up giving birth to his son Alexander II about 6 months after, 5 or 6 months after he died. But nobody knew she was pregnant at the time, so there was no sense that there was going to be an heir to this throne. And so what happens is that his generals and his leaders, he has no heir and no clear line of succession. So his generals gather around him and ask him, who are you giving your empire to? Who gets it? And they know that no matter who he gives it to, there's going to be battles fought, there's going to be wars fought. But at least if he picks somebody, there's some kind of a chance that there's some sort of a sense of a direction, and his troops, because of their loyalty to him, are likely to follow whoever it is that he nominates. And Alexander's answer, most likely, because he was very, very sick at the time, but most likely his answer translates into English as, who are you going to give your land to? Who are you going to give it to? To the strongest. That's his answer. I'm going to give it to the strongest. So basically what he's basically saying is, whoever can take it can have it. And that's what he says before he dies. So there's no line of succession. And of course, part of it is, even though people tended to die young and get sick from unexpected things, as the kind of success that he'd had and the kind of vigor that he demonstrated, there was just no reason whatsoever to think that he needed to have a succession plan in place. It wasn't like he was leading his armies from the front most of the time, where he was putting himself in mortal jeopardy all the time. So it was a situation where, on some level at least, because of the risks of poison and assassination, it probably should have been thought through a little bit more carefully, but the reality was there just wasn't good reason to expect he was going to need to do that. And so ultimately the result is chaos after that, for a period of time anyway. Now one of the interesting things, I said there were several different prophecies in Daniel that talk about Greece and various parts of Greece. Or various Greece and the other kingdoms. And one of the most interesting ones, one of the most striking ones, is in Daniel chapter 8, where Daniel says, I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is, if you remember, that's that capital city of Persia. I was in the citadel of Susa, and I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal, and I lifted up my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue him from his power, but he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had the 2 horns and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come up beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now Daniel sees this vision, and then an angel comes along to give him some of the interpretations of this vision. And one of the things the angel says, remember, there's a ram and there's a goat. The ram is the first one with 2 horns. He says, the ram which you saw, this is what the angel says, the ram which you saw with the 2 horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. So the first horn is Media, the second horn is Persia. It's the one that grows longer and more powerful. Then he goes on and said, the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. The broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. I want to go back and look at this prophecy a little more detail. I wanted to get to the end and get you the, here's what it means kind of a thing. But you notice what he says here. He sees a ram which had 2 horns was standing by the canal. The horns were long, one was longer than the other one, so the longer one comes up last. So Media is the first horn, Persia is the second horn. And he sees the ram going westward, northward, and southward. He says he doesn't see it going eastward. That actually makes sense because Susa and the territory it controlled was already started off in the east, and then it moved to the west and to the north and to the south. No other beast could stand before him. He is pleased to magnify himself. And then it says, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. What does that mean to you, that it was without touching the ground? Flying? Okay. Moving. When you say moving, what do you mean?
He's going through and nobody's stopping.
Okay. Yeah. He's going. He's not being stopped, and he's going fast. He's just flying across the earth basically, which really speaks to what happened with Alexander. Like I said, historically nobody had ever done anything like this before. Now we're going to see, if we look in modern day times or relatively modern day times, you can see some examples of nations conquering large areas very, very quickly using mechanized forces and air forces and things like that. But in ancient times where battles and wars were fought by men on the ground who had to walk everywhere, this is just abnormal to be able to do this. So then it says he had a conspicuous horn between the eyes, a single horn. Obviously that's Alexander. He rushed at the ram, he struck the ram, shattered the horns, and he hurled him to the ground, and there was no one to rescue him. And then it says he magnified himself greatly. But as soon as he was mighty, and that's exactly what happens to Alexander. I mean, less than 2 years after he conquers all of this, the large horn is broken, he's dead. And in his place there came up 4 conspicuous horns from the 4 winds of heaven. And so the angel says the ram is Media and Persia, the goat is Greece, the large horn is, he doesn't say this, but the large horn is Alexander. The 4 horns are 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation. So this is what's interesting. So here is that map of Alexander's controlled territories. All of this is territory that's controlled by him. Well, almost all of it. This is Rome over here. These are some Greek colonies in Rome. But the core of Greece stretches from here all the way down, all the way up into here. Basically all of the Persian Empire plus some more and a little bit of things over here that the Persians didn't control. That's all Greece. But this is immediately, or this is essentially a few years after Alexander's death. What happens is that Greece gets apportioned up into 4 sections. This section here, Asia Minor, is what it's sometimes called. But this section here becomes actually becomes the territory we're getting Seleucus, and it's going to become the Seleucid dynasty. This larger yellow part here. This part here that's in orange is the kingdom of Lysimachus. It's going to become Asia. Actually, it's going to be referred to as Asia Minor. I should have. No, Syria, I think. Anyway, Not entirely sure. This one down here, these two are not really that important for what we're studying here. That's why I'm not really sure. I didn't pay a lot of attention. This is the kingdom of Cassander. It is ultimately kind of referred to as Macedonian Greece. And this down here, this is where the colors start to really mess things up. This dark color down here, this is actually the kingdom of Ptolemy, which would become the Ptolemaic Empire. Essentially, it is Egypt. So the Ptolemaic Empire is centered around Alexandria. The Seleucid Empire is centered around Antioch. Alexandria was built by Alexander. Antioch is built by one of his generals about 5 years after his death. And those two cities would become the central cities of the Greek Empire in a lot of ways. And these two nations or territories would compete against each other for control, where these other states gradually faded into less and less significance. These two kept fighting all the way up until the Roman Empire. And you can see, inevitably, where it is that they have their fights at, right? Because you can see where they run into each other. And guess what's right down in here? Jerusalem, Judea, the promised land is right in here. And in fact, for much of the time, the Seleucids control the area immediately around Jerusalem in this area, and the Ptolemies actually have control the area around that. It's kind of like East Berlin or Berlin, and then the rest of Germany or East Germany that was around that. Berlin was controlled by the Allies.
Palestine and Israel.
Palestine and Israel. So I mean, so they're kind of cut off here, but essentially the struggling point is right in this area here along the Mediterranean. That's where most of those battles take place. But the key that I want you to understand from this is looking at Daniel's prophecy is what we've got is 1, 2, 3, 4 kingdoms. Just exactly what Daniel said was going to happen. There are 4 specific kingdoms that ultimately end up coming out of the Greek Empire. And ultimately at the end of that, of the Persians. But the Greek Empire is going to go on for quite a long time. Alexander, even though he died and was not able to reign over this area, the Greek Empire continues on for quite a long time after him, quite successfully, because, well, they kind of know what they're doing. So, okay, we're going to stop there because it's 10:16, and we will talk. We're going to talk next week about Israel during the classical Greek period. What was going on there? What happened when Alexander came in? How did that turn out? Actually, it's probably not going to be the way you expect, considering that they got into fights with everybody else. They actually got along with him pretty well. And then we will shift, and depending on how much time we have, we'll start talking about Hellenistic Greece, which is this period of time. Once Alexander dies, Hellenistic Greece takes over, and Hellenistic Greece goes on until essentially the Roman Empire comes into being. And so we'll look at Hellenistic Greece. That'll be our next major lesson in this, and then we'll have 2 more after that. One will be Israel self-rule for a period of time, and then finally we'll look at Rome, and that will be the end of it. So,
What year are we here?
we are at, so this is shortly after Alexander's death, which means that we are basically at about
333.
something like that, a little bit later than that. No, 323 is when he died. This is probably more like about 320 or maybe even 310, something like that. It takes a while for this to all sort of shake out, to kind of get, you have these 4 competing kingdoms to kind of get into a state of equilibrium where there's a relatively well-defined, here's where everybody is kind of a thing. So we're talking about the late, going towards 300 basically. So, okay, that's it. We're done.